Head over to the CallMeEzekiel merch store to pick up your very own Welcome to Finland 1940 hoodie. It's 10% off until February 16th. Link is in the description. Joseph Stalin sits alone in his office. He's thinking about a serious problem. It's that Karl Marx was wrong. Marx's mistake was not that communism didn't work. As far as Stalin was concerned, communism was working beautifully. The error was thinking that only advanced industrial societies could become communist. Yet, instead of France, Germany, or Britain falling to communism, the world's first socialist state was Russia. Poor, agricultural Russia. Stalin's problem was not ideological. Lenin had already fixed that problem decades ago with Leninism, the belief that communist revolutions can happen in partially industrialized states by using their fledgling proletariats to lead the peasants. Stalin's problem was practical. Since Lenin, not Marx, was proven right, it was not the world's most powerful states that became communist. It was its middle powers. Communist states had to play catch-up, and that's exactly what Stalin, as leader of the Soviet Union, tried to do. In a series of so-called 5-year plans, Stalin's Russia rapidly industrialized, with an emphasis on military industry, though this came at considerable cost to the nation's agriculture and finances. But Stalin could only take his rump Russian empire so far. The gap with the capitalist world seemed insurmountable. Then, in 1933, the Nazi Party came to power. Stalin made a fateful decision. He thought that if Russia couldn't defeat the capitalist powers on its own, perhaps the capitalist powers could be tricked into defeating themselves. By manipulating the ornery fascist and liberal states into war, the Soviet Union could build up its own strength and destroy the exhausted survivors. This sort of dialectical strategy is classic Marxism, or even Hegel. In 1939, the Soviet Union accomplished exactly that. Through little more than diplomacy, it convinced Germany to declare war on Poland, triggering the Allied guarantees on Polish independence so they'd declare war on Germany. The capitalist world was at war. The plan seemed to be going off perfectly. Victory for Stalin's vision of Marxist-Leninism was assured. Global socialism would be achieved. And best of all, the capitalists would do all of the hard work for him. All Stalin had to do was sit back and wait for word that the capitalist powers were ripe for conquest. Then, Foreign Minister Molotov enters his office. "Great news, Comrade Stalin, sir!" "What is it?" Stalin asks. "Did I say great news? I meant terrible news. The Germans just conquered France." "What?" "The Wehrmacht is lining up along our borders." "What?" "The Italians are invading Greece, and they're losing." "What?" So you can call me Ezekiel, and this is Stalin's plot to start World War II and how it nearly blew up in his face. Setting the world's great powers against themselves was no small task. Stalin's first attempt was collective security, a proposed alliance in which Russia, Britain, and France would lead the free states of Europe against Nazi aggression. But neither Britain nor France were interested. For most of the 1930s, they rejected every offer to collaborate with the Soviet Union. Only after the collapse of Czechoslovakia did the Allies take collective security seriously. At least they almost did. A military mission was sent to Leningrad to explore the possibility. But the mission negotiated in such bad faith there was no chance of an agreement, not that it was even given authority to sign one. The Allies simply did not trust the Soviet Union. But do you know who you can trust even less? Unsubscribed viewers. I know, you're all sick of hearing about them. But some of these unsubscribed viewers are so totally messed up and stupid, they don't even realize they can hit the subscribe button below this video and ring the little bell right next to it for free. Frankly, I'm sorry these dregs of society are allowed anywhere near you, subscribed viewers. You guys are so great, so smart and attractive. Actually, I just found out almost 10% of you guys watching are actually gals. You're great too. Total girl bosses, probably with awesome boyfriends. Unless you're not subscribed, in which case, no boyfriends. Complete femcells. Very sad. Luckily, the unsubscribed viewers are being compiled onto lists so the NKVD can gulag them. Unsubscribed viewers, this is your last chance to subscribe and hit the bell. Otherwise, tonight, you just might hear a knock on your door, and I can't answer for what's gonna happen next. With the Allies, like unsubscribed viewers, proving little better than a brick wall, the Soviet Union abandoned collective security for what seemed to be its opposite policy, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But remember, in reality, these were the same policy because they had the same goal, to drive Germany and the Allies into war. Who Russia allied itself with was secondary. This faux policy change was timed perfectly. By betraying the Allies at Munich, Russia was the only power Germany could still talk to. This desperate position meant the Germans conceded far more to Russia than the Allies would have. 2 of the 3 Baltic states, Finland, most of Poland, and parts of Romania, alongside trade and military cooperation. Best of all, unlike collective security, the Soviet Union would have no obligation to go to war. As the world tore itself apart, Russia was free to develop its strength. With the outbreak of European war on September 1st, 1939, Stalin's first concern was not in Europe at all. It was the border war he was still fighting against Japan. The Japanese had some interesting ideas regarding where they wanted to go with this. Hey Germany, there's a huge fight between me and Russia in Mongolia right now. Now would be an awesome time to invade from the other side. Oh, about that. Oh, fine. Russia, peace? Duh. Before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Japan hoped the Germans would join them in a pincer attack against Russia. But now that Germany and Russia were friends, Japan had no reason to continue, signing a ceasefire on the 15th. Russia invaded Poland 2 days later. Despite that, more of Poland wound up occupied by the Germans than initially agreed. Instead of fighting over it, Russia was compensated with Lithuania. The Baltic states were shortly strong-armed into letting the Red Army base troops in their countries. With its frigid terrain and historically warlike people, Finland would prove much tougher. But Moscow was not interested in total conquest, so much as moving the Finnish border away from the key Soviet city of Leningrad and the Leningrad-Murmansk Railway to the White Sea. Given Finland's situation, the Russians made a remarkably reasonable offer to trade Finnish territory on the Karelian Isthmus for a much larger, though poorer part of Soviet East Karelia. But the protocols dividing East Europe between Russia and Germany were secret. Only the Russians and Germans knew how weak Finland's position was. The Finns, still thinking they could rely on Germany for help, refused the offer. Russia declared war. The debacle the Red Army suffered in Finland is famous, and covered in our other videos. Needless to say, the Red Army lost hundreds of thousands of men before signing a compromise peace for Karelia and a few strategic border adjustments in the north. Or in the words of one Russian commander, barely enough land to bury our dead. Much of the disaster in Finland can be attributed to the reforms being implemented in the Red Army. Reforms which were only implemented then because the Russians were not expecting a conflict. The most famous reform was the officers' purge. While detrimental, the effects on the officer corps are heavily exaggerated. At most, 10% of officers were affected, and many would later return to service. Many of those purged were genuinely incompetent, with new classes of officers trained in modern warfare due to replace them. The most important reforms were to the Red Army's equipment and doctrine. In this respect, the Finland War was quite helpful. Many issues such as poor coordination between branches and inability of officers to take initiative on the ground were revealed. The war also demonstrated the deficiency of Soviet light tanks. Production was refocused on heavier designs like the T-34 and KVs. By the end of 1940, the million-strong Red Army would boast 23,000 tanks and over 22,000 warplanes. All along the Soviet Union's new frontiers with Germany, logistical infrastructure, equipment dumps, tank parks, and aerodromes were built in forward positions to prepare for offensives into Europe. As Germany and the Allies tore each other to shreds, Stalin was preparing the Red Army to strike into the heart of Europe. On May 10, 1940, Moscow was delighted by news of Germany's invasion into France and the Low Countries. But this delight turned to horror, as rather than grind down into the long war they expected, the Wehrmacht drove French and British armies into the sea before occupying most of France. In a panic, the Russians moved to take as much territory for themselves as they still could. Between June 14th and 16th, the three Baltic states, still technically independent, were invaded and annexed. On account of the war in Finland, Romania escaped Moscow's attention until late June. That month, the Soviets tried extorting the provinces of Bessarabia and Bukovina. Like in Finland, the Russians were in for a surprise, this time from the Germans, who pressured the Russians to leave half of Bukovina to Romania. Germany then awarded some of Romania's territory to Hungary and Bulgaria before guaranteeing the independence of what was left. At Romania's request, the Wehrmacht was stationed in their country. While none of this was a violation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Russians were clearly upset. Molotov asked Germany's ambassador to Moscow, Schulenburg, "Why have you given this guarantee? You knew that we had no intention of attacking Romania." To which Schulenburg replied, "That is just why we gave the guarantee. You have told us that you have no further claim on Romania. Our guarantee can, therefore, be no source of annoyance to you." On September 7th, Molotov tried and failed to win German assent to take the rest of Bukovina. On September 27th, 1940, Italy, Japan, and Germany signed the Tripartite Pact, seemingly surrounding Russia in enemies. Stalin truly must have felt the walls were closing in around him. So leave a comment saying, "Good job, Stalin, for accidentally putting the Soviet Union in one of the worst geostrategic positions in its history." Good job, Stalin. In any alliance between two powers, one will occupy the senior position, leaving the other its junior. In the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that senior power was supposed to be the Soviet Union. But victories in France had allowed the Germans to usurp their position. The Russians were desperate to reclaim any power they still could. The Black Sea region seemed the best avenue for expansion. At Moscow's request, the Bucharest Conference opened on October 28th to discuss a new order along the river Danube. There, the terrible state of Soviet-German relations had become impossible to ignore. The Russians tried demanding major concessions, such as to be the only nation other than Romania to administer the lower Danube, and for control over the strategic Kilia Arm, a chain of islands on the Romanian side of the new Soviet-Romanian border. At one point, a fistfight broke out between the Italian and Soviet delegations. Violence wasn't restricted to the conference. Border clashes between Russian and Romanian troops, supported by the Germans, were becoming a daily occurrence. Dozens of prisoners were taken, and at least one woman killed in the crossfire. Diplomacy, geopolitics, and ideology were all driving Germany and the Soviet Union towards war. Their soldiers were already clashing. But Berlin and Moscow had been partners once. They could be again. In November of 1940, top-level Russian and German diplomats would convene to try to sort out their differences one last time. Their discussions would decide the fate of the world. Before finding out what that fate will be, if you've gotten this far into a video about Soviet diplomacy and geopolitics during World War II, it must mean you're really enjoying it. Well, these videos are a massive collaboration between myself and a team of talented artists and video editors, a team that's only possible thanks to our supporters on Patreon. If you want to see more videos like this one, you can directly help make that happen by becoming a Patreon supporter too. Just click the link in the description. Our supporters don't just finance these videos, they get awesome rewards too, including adding one or more Countryballs to the group shot featured at the end of each video, getting your name into the credits, with our biggest Into Space tier supporters getting their names read aloud at the end of each video, and on our Discord server, we just added a new chat room that the whole server can see, but only Patreon supporters can post in, meaning you can flaunt your support to the plebs, and they can't do anything about it but cry using react emotes. Great fun for everyone. Except the plebs, of course, but who cares about them? As a special incentive, all new supporters get 50% off their first month or 20% off their first year. This offer ends February 16th. Link is in the description. Remember, these videos are impossible without your help. So let's get back to it. German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop was the first to propose expanding the tripartite pact into a four-power pact by admitting the Soviet Union. This would have been a monstrously powerful coalition, certainly capable of defeating Britain and even the Americans. Russia's foreign minister Vyacheslav Molotov was sent to Berlin to meet with him and Hitler personally. On November 12, 1940, Molotov arrived at the head of an extravagantly large delegation. He was met in suitably lavish fashion by his German hosts, who even publicly played the Communist International in Germany for the first time since 1933. Ribbentrop met with Molotov first. Quoting the German foreign minister, "England is beaten, and it is only a question of time when she will admit her defeat. The beginning of the end has now arrived for the British Empire." Ribbentrop suggested that the four members of the proposed pact, Germany, Japan, Italy, and Russia, all divide the spoils together. He also suggested the possibility of revising the Montreux Convention, which trapped the Red Fleet in the Black Sea. While interested, Molotov put off these elaborate and high-minded proposals for later. His business with Ribbentrop concluded, Molotov met with Hitler. Their discussion was held in a grand hall 90 feet long and 50 feet wide, guarded by two blonde men of the SS. Hitler opened the discussion. Germany has gained, as a result of this war, enough land to keep her occupied for 100 years. The implication being that the central Nazi idea of Lebensraum did not have to mean conflict with the Soviet Union. The Führer went on to claim that the troops in Romania would be withdrawn as soon as the war was over. The topic turned to Britain and America, who Hitler cast as villains for denying ocean access to Germany and Russia. With his political manifesto espoused, the conversation turned to contentious matters in Eastern Europe. Presumably, the carving up of new spheres of influence now that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had been exhausted. But before that could happen, the meeting was cut short by an Allied air raid. During the lull, Molotov reported the day's events to Stalin. Stalin ordered Molotov to win Hitler's assent for Soviet occupations of Bulgaria and the Bosporus. At lunch the next day, Hitler said to Molotov, quote, "I believe that our successes will be greater if we stand back to back and fight against the outside world than if we face each other down breast to breast." This was an allusion to their dispute in Romania. Finland also came up, as German troops had moved into the country after the Winter War, and Russia wanted them out. Not only did Hitler not commit to vacating Finland, he didn't let Russia have Bulgaria or the Turkish Straits either. The Führer instead repeated Ribbentrop's offer to reorient the Soviet Union towards the Middle East and renegotiate the Montreux Convention, leaving the Straits in Turkish hands. That night, the delegations partied. And like happened before, air raid sirens blared, forcing everyone into a shelter. Hey, Ribbentrop, can your air defenses work for one day? Maybe we could host better parties if you actually helped us finish the war. Tell it to them. Our British friends are complaining they've not been invited to the party. But don't worry, even without you, we'll have the British beaten soon enough. Then why are we in the shelter? And whose bombs are falling on us? Hey guys, we heard of the conference beforehand, and though not invited to join the discussion, did not wish to be left entirely out of the proceedings. The final German offer looked like this. The Montreux Convention would be rewritten to favor the Soviet Union, but the Turkish Straits would remain Turkish. The Russians would not be allowed into Finland, Romania, or Bulgaria, nor would German troops exit. Instead, the Russian sphere would include the Middle East and area around the Persian Gulf. This was amidst a wider partition of the world. Germany and Italy would split Africa, and Japan would take South Asia and Oceania. Germany's Ribbentrop was optimistic, but Molotov knew he could never accept this. It did not address any of Russia's concerns. So on November 25th, the Soviet Union made a counteroffer. Restating most of their initial demands, the Russian asked for Bulgaria, the Bosporus, Finland, and the abandonment of Japan's special concessions in northern Sakhalin, pointing out they would not be needed once Japan acquired the resource-rich Southeast Asia. The Russians were very hopeful, and repeatedly urged the Germans to respond, even going as far as to sign an especially favorable trade deal with them on January 10th, in hopes it would spur them to accept. On the 17th, Molotov asked again for Germany's answer, but the Germans still didn't respond. They never would. Germany had decided on war. There is no reason the four-power pact had to fail. Every involved power had made ideological compromises for geopolitical gain before. They could do it again. The failure lay in diplomacy. The fall of France ruined everyone's calculations. The Allies, Soviet Union, and even Germany itself could hardly believe what had happened. Victory had so shifted the balance of power in Germany's favor that the Russians would do nearly anything to re-equalize their relationship. What the Germans were offering was not enough to assuage Russian fears, but that was only because the Germans had their own insecurities. Even with the Red Army caught mid-reform, Russia still had massive leverage over Germany from the raw materials it fed the Wehrmacht and German industry, petroleum being the most important. Much of Romania's oil was transported through Soviet-controlled southern Poland, meaning 83% of German oil in some way came from or passed through the Soviet Union and Romania. The Germans feared giving the communists any more control over their petrol. Were that to happen, the Wehrmacht could boast whatever fleets of ships, tanks, and warplanes it wanted, but could never use them without Soviet assent. This German insecurity was provoked by Soviet demands for the rest of Bukovina, control over the Danube River, and stationing troops along Romania's southern Bulgarian border. The four-power pact was smothered in its crib because Berlin and Moscow were too fearful to compromise. Mutual distrust and ideology took over. It could only be war. On December 18th, Hitler signed Secret Order 21, officially committing Germany to invade the Soviet Union. The Bucharest Conference disbanded in failure 3 days later. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, was scheduled for May 15th. But the Balkans had other plans. Berlin and Moscow found themselves enmeshed in a miniature Cold War for influence in the region. Much like the more famous Cold War against America, the Soviet Union would prove the decisive loser. Back on October 28, 1941, as a result of diplomatic miscommunication with Germany, the Italians launched a disastrous invasion of Greece. Their armies were quickly pushed back into Albania as British troops entered the country. In an effort to bail out the Italians and secure their Balkan flank, the Germans pressured Bulgaria and Yugoslavia to join the Tripartite Pact and allowed the Wehrmacht through their countries. Both nations agreed. What should have been a quick mop-up operation was complicated when, on the 27th of March, 1941, just a few days after signing the pact, Yugoslavia's government was overthrown by pro-Allied military officers. Hoping to save their neutrality, the new government allied itself with Moscow, Germany's supposed friend. This victory for Moscow was won at virtually no cost or even effort on their part. But even if Yugoslavia wasn't aligned with their destined enemy, the now neutral country still stood between German armies in Greece. Barbarossa was pushed off to June 22nd so Yugoslavia could be invaded too. The same day Moscow and Belgrade signed their mutual defense agreement, the Germans invaded. When all was settled, the entirety of the Balkans, from Hungary to Romania to Greece, was under firm German control. But that all came at the cost of 5 good campaigning weeks in Russia. Germany would not invade the Soviet Union alone, but at the head of a coalition of most of the remaining states in Europe. And I specifically mean Europe, because Japan, despite its rabid anti-communism, would not participate. Hey Germany, do you want to help me invade Russia now? Oh, about that. Again? Really? We're signing another pact. Duh. Japan signed the Tripartite Pact believing it targeted the Soviet Union, but they had mistaken German intentions for the second time. The pact was really meant to redirect its signatories away from Russia and against Britain and America. After realizing its mistake, Tokyo followed the new direction and prepared for war against the Allies. To protect their flank, they signed the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact. Stalin understood this meant Japan would soon go to war against the Allies in Asia, a conflict he encouraged with Operation Snow, wherein Soviet agents, most famously Harry Dexter White, chief advisor to Treasury Secretary Morgenthau, manipulated US policy to provoke war between America and Japan. Hey Germany! Oh, Japan! We're finally ready to invade the Soviet Union with you. I know it took us a while, so thanks for being patient. Wait, really? I already signed a pact with them. I have a new enemy now. Oh, who is it? Why? European allies would prove much more cooperative. Finland would contribute 475,000 men to the invasion. Romania 325,000, another 100,000 came from Hungary and Slovakia. Spain contributed 18,000 men in Volunteer Division Azul, mostly young Spanish fascists, who Franco was hoping to get killed so they'd stop bothering him. Italy was not told of the invasion in advance, but would eventually contribute 62,000 men to it. The Turks, unwilling to participate, settled for a benevolent neutrality. The invasion force was a little over 3 million men, supported by 3,300 tanks, 2,250 warplanes, and 7,146 guns. Barely more men, and roughly the same number of tanks that invaded France. The Air Force was actually 1/3 smaller than the Battle of France. Truly a paltry force to attack a much larger Red Army supported by tens of thousands of tanks and warplanes. Yet incredibly, just like happened against France, the defending Red Army was almost perfectly situated to be destroyed by the invading forces. To the post-war observer, This preoccupation with planning for the steps to follow the quick victory over the Soviet Union may appear ludicrous, but it must be understood as one of the few lessons drawn by the Germans from their difficulties in following up on the great victory over France. The perception of a weak Soviet Union could not be remedied by accurate intelligence. The Germans had very little, and they would not be dissuaded by those whose estimates of Soviet strength were more perceptive, primarily because the prejudice against Slavic peoples were reinforced by the euphoria of victory in the West. Germany had practically no agents inside the Soviet Union, except for those actually working for Moscow and feeding them disinformation. They quickly forgot that the Red Army had learned fast from its early defeats at the hands of the Finns. It was now assumed that they would or could not learn from defeats inflicted by the Germans. Operation Barbarossa's top priority was to destroy the Red Army at the border so it could not retreat and drag out the war till winter. 5 good campaign weeks were already lost in Yugoslavia. Once the Red Army was destroyed, the Wehrmacht would advance to a line roughly between northern Arkhangelsk and southern Astrakhan. Before 1941, the Russians were only prepared for defensive military operations against Germany. In 1941, the Red Army shifted to offensive footing, with a particular ramp-up beginning in April, right before the invasion in June. There's much controversy as to why the Red Army assumed this offensive posture. According to Chris Bellamy, in his Absolute War, Soviet Russia in the Second World War, there are 3 possibilities. The first is that the moment the war started, the Soviet Union intended to carry it to enemy territory, and to fight it as offensively as possible. That would be fully consistent with the military doctrine enshrined in the 1939 Field Service Regulations. If an enemy imposes war upon us, the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army will be the most offensively minded of all attacking armies in history. Secondly, the Soviet Union could have been going slightly further and was simply preparing a limited preemptive strike to forestall the German attack which its general staff, intelligence services, and even Stalin himself knew was coming. Eventually. That might help explain certain anomalies about Soviet deployments and the speed and scale of the initial German successes. If the Red Army was caught on one foot as it was itself preparing to strike, it would be more vulnerable than if hunkered down in defensive positions. That would certainly explain Stalin's paranoia about not provoking the Germans as he put his own ducks in a row. The third, most ambitious thesis, championed by Suvorov, is that Stalin engineered the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to provoke conflict between the Western powers, enabling Hitler to start the European War, which would become the Second World War. Then, he would exploit the mutual destruction of competing powers and overrun Europe. If one then accepts that Hitler launched his 1941 attack to preempt Stalin and save Western civilization, that shifts the blame for starting the Second World War, as well as the war on the Eastern Front, away from Hitler and towards Stalin. In historical terms, this is a shift which rates very highly on the Richter scale. One can see why most Russians reject it absolutely. The Suvorov thesis is most aligned with the narrative presented in this video, but this video does not accept Bellamy's suggestion that Barbarossa was a preemptive strike. The best evidence for that is entirely circumstantial, that the Red Army was deployed for offensive operations. And, as Bellamy just described, there are other likely explanations for this. Besides, even if the Russians really were about to invade, the Germans didn't believe it. The decision to invade had already been made all the way back in December 1940, and was delayed by Yugoslavia. How can you delay a preemptive strike? Nazi ideology had always called for the conquest of Eastern Europe and the destruction of Bolshevism. So at most, one could say that as rivals, Germany and Russia would end up in a conflict eventually, so the Germans chose to do it on their terms. As Sean McMeekin put it in his Stalin's War, A New History of World War II, in his speech to the German people on June 22, 1941, which justifies the attack once it was in progress, Hitler only made a pro forma reference to the Soviet military buildup on the German frontier, and more recent provocations such as the coup in Yugoslavia, which he blamed on Churchill and Stalin, carefully avoiding mention of Roosevelt and the still neutral United States. Hitler spent most of his energy on old business, citing chapter and verse from his bitter encounter with Molotov in Berlin, including all key points from Stalin's ultimatum of November 25th, demanding a German withdrawal from Romania and Finland, a Soviet guarantee to Bulgaria, and the right to occupy the Turkish Straits. Hitler concluded, "Moscow not only broke our treaty of friendship, but betrayed it." Until his illusions were shattered, Stalin was convinced there was a considerable faction in Berlin still friendly to Russia, that it was the Wehrmacht, not Hitler, who wanted war. Much of this was based on a misunderstanding. Schulenburg, German ambassador to Moscow, was genuinely opposed to Barbarossa. Despite failing to convince anyone in Berlin against it, Schulenburg told Stalin it was possible to restore trust anyway. This lined up with Soviet intelligence, which believed the pro-war faction was led by Göring, while the Russophiles included the more influential Hitler and Ribbentrop. All of this was false. Nearly all of Germany's leadership wanted to invade. As the date for Barbarossa approached, more and more reports reached Stalin of the coming invasion. The massive military preparations were impossible not to notice. Accurate intelligence also came from Stalin's spies in Germany, analysts within the USSR, and even the British, who'd long since cracked German Enigma codes and knew the invasion was coming. In the hours leading up to war, there were even multiple sympathizers crossing the border to warn of the imminent invasion. Stalin dismissed all of it as disinformation. On June 21st, 1941, in the face of overwhelming evidence, Soviet forces were finally ordered to full combat readiness, but also with a mandate not to provoke the Germans. This led to such incredible actions as concentrating aircraft at frontline airfields while also forbidding them from getting off the ground when German aircraft approached. 1,200 Soviet warplanes would be destroyed in just the first day of fighting. Whether or not the Red Army was truly caught by surprise is pedantic. So much accurate intelligence had come that most Red Army leadership, including top generals like Zhukov, knew the invasion was coming, almost down to the hour. But Stalin was either delusional or desperately hoping to avoid provoking the conflict, so denied the Red Army the chance to fully prepare. Even if the Red Army was not psychologically surprised, in practice, it may as well have been. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. There is a popular narrative that in response to the invasion of his country, Stalin virtually disappeared for 10 days. Many find this story compelling. Unfortunately for them, it's completely untrue. The source of this story are the memoirs of Nikita Khrushchev, who, you must note, is the man who denounced Stalin. What the evidence proves is that Stalin held 29 emergency meetings with senior government ministers on the first day alone. Industry was quickly evacuated east. The Red Army immediately ordered into action with vigorous counterattacks. Interestingly, the Red Navy had not been hamstrung the way the Army had, meaning the first shots fired by Russian forces almost certainly came from them in Sevastopol against German bombers. The exact course of Operation Barbarossa is likely already familiar to you. Needless to say, by the time it ended, vast tracts of Soviet territory, including major cities like Kiev, were under German occupation. Millions of Red Army soldiers were killed or captured, and the Wehrmacht was outside major cities, including Leningrad and Moscow. Russian resistance was far more tenacious than the Germans had expected based on their performance in Finland. The Red Army may have suffered 4.5 million casualties in Barbarossa, but they could afford it. The 1 million men lost by Germany were irreplaceable. Moreover, this immense cost did not win Germany the complete victory it needed or expected. The Germans had accurately assessed the size of and annihilated much of the standing Red Army, but they knew little of the vast manpower reserves and industry the Soviet Union could fall back on. As part of his efforts to project strength and discourage the invasion, Stalin had once allowed German representatives to tour Russia's vast industries in Siberia. But when they got back to Germany, their reports were dismissed as too absurd to believe. The Germans did not understand that the Soviet Union had spent at least a decade preparing for exactly this kind of conflict. Both the Soviet and Nazi states had miscalculated their way into a long war of annihilation. It would be fought virtually without law. Russian prisoners were systemically starved to death by the Germans. Russia's NKVD internal security forces implemented a massive crackdown against their own people in just the opening days of the invasion. Perhaps at no point was the Soviet state more tyrannical as during its Great Patriotic War. Despite all of that, there was a single act of humanity, or at least international law, in those opening days of the conflict. One almost reminiscent of the old days of chivalry. You see, when the war started, most Soviet citizens in Germany were arrested and sent to concentration camps. But not Russia's diplomats. They were allowed to return safely. So were the German diplomats in Moscow. After all, when the war ended, someone would be needed to offer the surrender. Joseph Stalin had, by all accounts, played an excellent diplomatic game. The capitalist world almost destroyed itself without the communists having to fire a shot. That this plan failed so catastrophically might just be down to poor luck. Even the best poker player is bound to lose many strong hands. Barbarossa, while spectacular, achieved none of its key objectives. The Red Army was not destroyed. The Wehrmacht got nowhere close to the Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan line. Not even Murmansk or the railroad connecting it to the rest of Russia was neutralized. Left in Russian hands, it allowed the Allies to supply the Red Army for the duration of the war. There's no reason Barbarossa even had to go that well. The Red Army massively outnumbered its invaders, be it in manpower, guns, tanks, and aircraft. Key Russian equipment like tanks were even qualitatively superior to what the Germans brought. The skill and experience of the Wehrmacht in 1941 should not be understated. But most of Barbarossa's success, what little there was, can be attributed to poor Russian posture, not German excellence. The Soviet Union would emerge from this war victorious, a victory that would cost them an estimated 27 million lives. But how terrible a price is that really, to buy the Red Army's entry to Berlin and virtual dominion over Europe? And that's Stalin's plot to cause World War II and how it nearly blew up in his face. This video was funded by the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs and its top political commissars, Commissar Bragg, Duke Nelson, Feline Man, G.S. Rogers, Josiah, Karazin, Lord Inquisitor Zarius Dracart, Micro, Pater, Swiss Cheesus, the Raven Union, the Union of X, and welcoming back Petri von Steiff. Don't forget to pick up your hoodie for 10% off and join our Patreon for 50% off your first month or 20% off your first year. Links are in the description, but these offers end February 16th. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one.